The Sugo 16 from Silverstone is a really clean looking small form factor case which sells for around 90 USD. But is it any good? Let's find out. What's up everyone, Eric here and welcome to Hardware for Gamers. For those of you who are new to the channel, I review and test PC cases, CPU coolers, and PC case fans. Now before I get into the overview, just to have full disclosure, Silverstone did send me over this case to test and review, but as always, all the opinions expressed in this video are mine, so if you end up liking this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel because it does help out a lot. Now I am really sorry if there's any background noise, but it's really hot outside so I do have the fans on, so again, sorry if there is any background noise. I'll be starting the overview with a quick rundown of the Sugo lineup from Silverstone. The Sugo lineup is Silverstone's small form factor case lineup. The Sugo 16 is the newest edition. It comes in black or white and is just under 14 liters with the feet attached. There's also the Sugo 15 and 14, which again both have two color options, but these are a bit larger with both of them pushing near 20 liters. And the last case I'm going to touch on in the Sugo series is the ever popular Sugo 13, which is under 12 liters and comes in pink. What else do you need to know? Okay then, now that we know a little bit about the Sugo series, let's get into the Sugo 16. The front of the case has a perforated steel panel. While the top of the case has the front I/O, there is a combo port for the front audio out and microphone. There are two USB 3.0 Type A ports, as well as a restart and power button. There is also a magnetic dust filter on the top of the case. Moving to the rear of the case, we see the rear I/O location, the AC pass-through plug, two horizontal expansion slots with reusable covers, as well as tooling for a 120mm fan. Moving to the left side of the case, there is a steel panel. This panel is held in by two captive screws at the rear of the case. Moving to the right side of the case, the right side has a perforated steel side panel and is again held in by two captive thumb screws at the rear. So to remove these panels is the same. Undo the two captive thumb screws at the rear of the case, then slide the panel back and lift it away. The right side panel does have a removable dust filter on the inside of the panel. The front panel can also be removed. This panel is held in by steel nubs, so simply pull the panel away from the chassis. Taking a closer look at the front panel, there is a magnetic dust filter on the inside of the panel, so cleaning out this case should be pretty straightforward. Looking back at the chassis, we see the power supply location, a GPU pass-through, this is to help get the video card into the case, and tooling for a multi-purpose mounting location. I'll explain that a bit better in a bit. The bottom of the case is simply just a sheet of steel-ish. The Sugo 16 comes with a small accessory bag. This bag has all the screws and fittings in it. There is also quite a few zip ties and 4 rubber nubs. Now there is no manual included in the box, but there is a QR code on the box that should bring you to the Sugo 16 page on Silverstone's website, and you can download the manual from there if you want. Now back to the 4 rubber nubs that come in the accessory bag. These are the feet, and you can or should attach them yourself. To attach them, peel the paper off the top, then stick the flat sticky side onto the bottom of the case. Now the dimensions of this case with the feet attached is 24.2 centimeters high by 20 centimeters wide by 29 centimeters deep. And that's the exterior of the case. Now before I move on to the interior of the case, if you do like what I'm doing here, can you please hit that like button? And if you really like what I'm doing here, can you please support the channel by using the Amazon Associates links in the description? All you need to do is click on the link that suits your location and then add an item or items to your cart and order them. The channel will get a small kickback at no extra cost to you. Okay, with that out of the way, looking at the inside of the case, along the bottom of the case there is a drive tray for one 2.5-inch drive. As I said before, at the rear of the case there is tooling for one 120mm fan. Now it is possible to install a second drive or a second fan at the front of the case using that multi-purpose mounting thing. So you can have a 3.5-inch drive or a 2.5-inch drive, or a 120 or a 92 or an 80 millimeter fan. Yeah, multi-purpose. Now you can only use a 120 millimeter fan if you're using an SFX size power supply. So that is SFX and SFXL. Which brings me to the next point. You can have an ATX power supply in this case. Now you will want to keep the ATX power supply as short as possible to make sure that you have room for the power supply cable clump thing that you're going to create. But it is pretty nice that Solarstone gives you the option to have an ATX power supply. Moving on to the motherboard tray, there's not too much going on here. There is a large cutout and mounting for ITX motherboards. Now the SUGO 16 supports mini ITX and mini DTX motherboards. The maximum GPU length is 275 millimeters, with the max CPU cooler height being 172 millimeters if you go with an SFX power supply. Now that could be cut down to as little as 85 millimeters if you go with an ATX or SFXL power supply. Now turning the case around to look at the backside of the motherboard tray, the cutout on the motherboard tray should be large enough to access any M.2s on the backside of the motherboard. And that brings us to the cooling options of the SUGO 16. In its stock configuration, the SUGO 16 has no fans, but depending on how you configure this case, the chassis can support up to 2 fans. You can have one 120 millimeter fan at the rear and 1 fan at the front. Now, if you prefer having 140 millimeter fans, then you're out of luck because this case doesn't support 140 millimeter fans. For radiator support, you can have one 120 millimeter radiator at the rear and or one 120 millimeter radiator at the front, again depending on how you have the case configured. Well, that's it for the overview, but before I get into the build notes, if you are finding this video helpful, you may want to check out some of my other case reviews. I'll have a card above to the playlist, and I'll also have the playlist linked down in the description. Okay, now for the build notes. Starting off with cable management, there is no real way to properly do cable management in this case. Not to say it really needs to be proper, because you should be using a modular power supply, so you are just trying to route the cables the best you can, and that's doing a pretty okay job. Now I did only build in this case using the SFXL power supply I used for my testing. So if you are using an ATX power supply, you're going to need a nice wad of cables and get them really nice and tight to kind of get them shimmied up somewhere so they're out of the way. Because ATX power supply cables are longer than SFX and SFXL cables, so you will need to make sure you get a nice tight wad of cables and kind of stick them somewhere, which might be difficult depending on your power supply. Now the biggest issue I had with building in this case was plugging in my video card's power connector, and that's because the 8-pin power connector is literally in line with the frame of the case, so just getting it in there, moving the cable in there was extremely difficult. Now I did install the card and then plugged the 8-pin in, so if I were to do this again, I would plug the 8-pin in first and then feed the card and the cable in through that GPU pass-through, and that would likely fix this issue. The last thing I wanted to go over isn't really an issue, it's more of just an understanding, and that's once you have the power supply in, you can't access the motherboard, and this will be doubly true if you're going with an ATX power supply. So the power supply will need to come out every time you want to access the motherboard, so again, just something that you want to keep in mind. And that's all of my build notes. Now for the temperature testing, I tested 4 configurations. Now if you do have any questions on how I test the cases, please check out my case testing methodology video. I'll have a card above and I'll also have it linked down in the description. Starting off with the CPU workload temperatures. So in its stock configuration, i.e. no fans, the average CPU temperature was 75.9 C, so you will want to buy at least 1 fan for this case. Then having the 1 exhaust fan at the front and 1 exhaust fan at the rear had the average CPU temperature at 65.9 C. Then with just 1 exhaust fan at the rear, the average CPU temperature was 63.8 C. Then with 1 intake fan at the front and 1 exhaust fan at the rear, the average CPU temperature didn't really change, with a temperature of 63.6 C. Onto the game testing. So in its stock configuration, again meaning no fans, the GPU thermally throttled, so it failed this test. So again, you do need to buy at least 1 fan for this case. Then with 1 intake fan at the front and 1 exhaust fan at the rear, the average CPU temperature was 39 C, and the average GPU temperature was 70 C. With one exhaust fan at the rear, the average CPU temperature was 41.5 C, and the average GPU temperature was 68.6 C. Then, with one exhaust fan at the front and one exhaust fan at the rear, had the average CPU temperature at 41.4 C, and the average GPU temperature at 67.7 C. So having the two fans as exhaust does give a slight lead over just the one exhaust fan when gaming. So then, how does the Sugo 16 stack up to the other cases I've tested? At stock, not very well. Please install at least one fan in this case. Now, when you do add a fan or fans to this case, in the CPU workload test, it's in the middle of the chart, so not great and not horrible. Then in the gaming tests, it performs pretty okay with just one exhaust fan. So again, please install at least one fan in this case. So then, is the Sugo 16 from Silverstone any good? Simply put, it's a very nice little case. And when I say little, I mean little. There's nearly a 5-liter difference between this and the NR200, which the NR200 is a little case in its own right, and this is pretty much 25% smaller than that. Now, I do have an issue with this case, and that's the case does require at least having one fan, but Silverstone doesn't include any fans, which I really don't like. So if you are looking for a really small form factor case that can actually house some pretty decent hardware, this should be a pretty good option. Now, is it the best option? I don't know yet. I haven't really tested enough small form factor cases. Now, again, this is like 25% smaller than the NR200, which is like the gold standard for small form factor cases. That 25% is a big difference, like literally, like it's a quarter smaller, like it's a lot smaller. So to actually compare the two cases, when you're talking about like a standard mid-tower case to a standard mini-tower case is like 20%. So there's more of a difference percentage-wise between this and then the NR200 than there is between the NR600 and the NR400. Like it's just really hard to compare this kind of stuff. So what I'm going to say is, if you are looking for a really compact case to have as an HPC or whatever, like this should do the job. It's a really well engineered case that looks really nice, that can actually hold an ATX power supply. Now, by holding an ATX power supply, you are kind of limiting what you can actually do with the case, so you do have to keep that in mind. But like, it works, it looks good. Temperatures, just as long as you have one fan in there, are perfectly fine. I really do feel what Silverstone has been able to do for this size of a case is pretty impressive. And that's all I got for this one. So if you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you're still watching and you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and the bell icon so you get notified whenever I drop a new video. There's also the HFG Discord server. I post all the charts, so the charts that are in this video will go up on the HFG Discord server, as well as all the other charts for the other case tests, the other CPU coolers, and all the case fans that I test go up there. So it is a great place to get all the information. And as always, thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.